The rain fell in thin, needling lines over the sprawl of Belgrave Square, dampening the grandeur of one of London's most distinguished addresses. At number 43, an elegant, cream-coloured townhouse belonging to the late Sir Horace Kellam, industrialist and noted philanthropist. The butler opened the door at exactly 7:32 a.m. to begin his usual morning routine. The house, usually humming with a dozen servants and the sharp voice of Lady Kellam dictating correspondence, was quiet, eerily so. He made his way to the study, expecting the comforting clink of a teacup or the rustle of newspapers. Instead, the door stood ajar, and inside, slumped over the Persian rug, lay Sir Horace's body. Lifeless, a smear of dried blood along the temple, and beside him, a maid in uniform who none of them had ever seen before. She was young, no more than 23, and quite dead. Her face was pale, her uniform pristine, and her hands neatly folded on her lap. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, and none of the household staff could recall hiring a new maid. Lady Kellam, upon being summoned, turned white as the drapes and uttered only, "That girl. She wasn't on my staff." By noon, Scotland Yard had arrived. Chief Inspector Japp stood stiffly in the study, watching officers comb for clues with their usual lack of delicacy. The uniformed girl had been removed, and Sir Horace's body was being examined by the coroner. There were no signs of poison, no defensive wounds, and no motive. He turned to Lady Kellam. "You're quite sure she didn't work here?" "I interview every servant myself, Chief Inspector. That girl, I've never seen her in my life." As the household gathered in the drawing room, murmuring and dazed, Japp closed the study doors and lit a cigarette. The case was strange. Stranger than most. A dead man of influence. A second corpse in a maid's disguise. No one missing from the house. No theft. And the only key to the study still in Sir Horace's dressing gown. That evening, Japp picked up the phone. "He won't like being called in this late. But I have no bloody choice," he muttered. "Better the little grey cells than blundering in the dark." At 9 p.m., a black cab pulled up in front of number 43. The doorman peered out to see a compact man with waxed moustaches step elegantly from the vehicle, umbrella in one hand, a perfectly brushed bowler hat in the other. Hercule Poirot stood still for a moment, his eyes travelling up the house with detached interest. "Une maison très riche," he murmured, but inside, disorder. Japp met him at the door. "You'll like this one, Poirot. Nothing stolen, nothing forced. 2 people dead, one of whom apparently never existed." Poirot removed his gloves slowly. "Ah, that is already most intriguing. 2 bodies and 1 identity too many." They walked into the study. Poirot's gaze swept the room, noting the thick carpet, the shattered porcelain vase near the writing desk, and the absence of anything visibly out of place, except the strange, quiet emptiness. "And you say the girl was dressed as a maid, mon ami, but nobody knew her?" "Exactly. Lady Kellam says she was never hired. The other staff swear they'd never seen her before." Poirot knelt by the rug, examining the place where the maid had been seated, her posture oddly dignified for someone so violently dispatched. "Forgive me, Japp, but do the English often sit like statues when they are about to die? She was already dead when we got here. No signs of a struggle." Poirot raised a brow. No signs of struggle can sometimes mean very great resistance. Internal, perhaps. "Tell me, had anyone rung the agency lately for new staff?" "None. And the agency confirmed they've sent no one new to number 43 for over 3 months. Poirot walked slowly to the corner of the room, where the maid's cap had fallen. He lifted it delicately and examined the inside seam. There, in tiny blue thread, the initials E.M. were stitched. Tiens! She did not borrow this uniform, at least not carelessly. She prepared for this moment, non. A name concealed, a role assumed, and then death. Japp frowned. So she came here on purpose. Poirot tapped his temple. "You English, You think in facts. But me, I ask. Why would a young woman dress herself as a servant, sneak into the home of an aging magnate, sit quietly beside him, and allow herself to die? He looked toward the large fireplace. On the mantel sat a clock, ticking steadily. Poirot adjusted it by exactly 30 seconds. Order, Jap. Everything must be in its place. But someone has upset the order here. I intend to put it back. Outside, the rain deepened. Inside, Poirot turned to face the assembled household. Lady Kellam stood like stone. Her son, Charles, a sallow man of 30 with an impatient jaw, leaned on the banister. The housekeeper, Mrs. Drummond, clutched a handkerchief, her knuckles white. Poirot's voice was calm, but penetrating. Mesdames et messieurs, I require only one thing from you this evening, the truth. And I assure you, it will be far more comfortable if you offer it now, before I must peel it from your silences. He turned to Jap. You shall interview them each, and I shall observe. It is not what they say that matters. It is what they believe they are hiding. Jap opened his notebook. Poirot stared once more at the carpet where the mystery maid had died. A girl enters a house pretending to be a maid and dies beside a man of immense power, Poirot whispered. This is no ordinary case, Jap. This is a performance, and every performance hides a playwright. By early morning, the staff of number 43 Belgrave Square stood in silent unease within the green drawing-room, their faces pale beneath the soft gleam of the chandelier. The atmosphere had soured overnight, curdled by whispered questions and the looming presence of Hercule Poirot, who sat near the hearth, hands neatly steepled, observing them like a cat observing a cage of birds. Lady Kellam, regal despite her black mourning dress, occupied the settee with rigid posture, her long neck held taut as a violin string. Her son Charles leaned against the window, smoking with a disdainful detachment that seemed rehearsed. Near the tea-cart stood Mrs. Drummond, the housekeeper, her eyes red-rimmed from weeping, but her jaw tight with control. Behind her hovered young Elsie, the scullery maid, who looked perpetually on the verge of tears. The valet, Mr. Sturgis, cool and precise, maintained a respectful distance from them all. The gardener, Mr. Hobday, had been summoned in from the back entrance and sat on the edge of a chair, visibly uncomfortable in the presence of polished furniture. Poirot allowed a moment of silence to bloom, as if listening for the thoughts each one struggled not to say. Jap, beside him, cleared his throat. Right then. One by one we'll speak to each of you. This isn't a trap, but lies will waste our time, and Monsieur Poirot does not like his time wasted. Charles Kellam stubbed out his cigarette with unnecessary force. Let's get on with it. I've an appointment at noon. Poirot's mustache twitched. Monsieur Kellam, appointments pale in importance when death has made its own. The interviews began in the study, with Jap leading each suspect while Poirot observed in silence, his gaze unrelenting, his attention fixed not on what was said, but on how it was said. Lady Kellam entered first, swathed in black silk, her brooch a sharp ruby glint against her chest. My husband and I retired early, she said crisply. We had a dinner guest, a family friend, Dr. Bexley. He left around 9. I last saw Horace at 10, alive and, well. Poirot tilted his head. Was he troubled lately, madame? Financially, emotionally? She stiffened. Certainly not. Horace was a man of unshakable discipline. If anything was troubling him, he would not have shown it. He despised fuss. Yet you did not hear anything last night. No movement, no voices, no unexpected sound. No, she said, and I sleep lightly. Poirot nodded politely. Thank you, madame. That is all. For now. Charles Kellam sauntered in next. His pale blue eyes were alert beneath a mask of boredom. Sir Horace was your stepfather, n'est-ce pas? Poirot asked. Technically. He married my mother when I was 12. Treated me as an accessory, nothing more. Did you have a strained relationship? Charles shrugged. I wouldn't say strained. Distant, He never approved of how I ran my affairs. Thought I should be in steel like him, not investments and art. Poirot pressed on. And you were home last night? I was, reading in the lounge, alone. Poirot noted the answer but said nothing. Instead, he gestured at Charles' jacket. That is a rather fine silk handkerchief. You prefer colored ones? Charles glanced down, then back up with a sneer. Not particularly. Why? Poirot smiled. I find small details illuminating. Mrs. Drummond, the housekeeper, entered with a curtsy. Sir, I've been with the family 20 years. I swear to you I don't know who that girl was. No maid came through me. Jap leaned forward. Could she have come in pretending to be staff? Maybe while you were out? Mrs. Drummond bristled. I don't step out without checking all entries locked and logged. Besides, I wasn't out yesterday. Too many guests lately. Dr. Bexley dines often. Poirot interjected, This Dr. Bexley. Is he close to the family? He's practically family. Treated Lady Kellam's nerves for years, and Sir Horace's gout. Poirot made a note. Did he speak with Sir Horace alone last night? Oh, yes. They often had private talks, but the girl... Sir, the girl, that's what I can't understand, who dresses up as a maid only to die like that. And she looked so... calm. Poirot murmured. Yes, calm is a strange word to use for the dead, and yet appropriate. Mr. Sturgis, the valet, was next. He had the manner of a man who could fold a pocket square with military precision. I last saw Sir Horace at 10 when I brought his tea and newspaper, he said. He was in his armchair, slippers on, reading the Financial Times. Nothing seemed wrong. Did you notice the girl? No, sir, but then again, I wouldn't have paid much mind to a scullery maid unless she'd caused trouble. Poirot leaned forward. And your master, did he ever receive unannounced visitors? Rarely. He detested unpredictability. Merci. Poirot dismissed him with a polite nod. Elsie, the young scullery maid, entered wringing her apron. She looked no older than 17 and couldn't seem to meet Poirot's eyes. I swear, sir, I don't know who she was. I'd never seen her before, she stammered. You're quite certain? Yes, sir, but I think I heard something last night. Not late, maybe just after 10. A soft knock. Downstairs. Why did you not say this before? Jap asked. I didn't want to be blamed, and it wasn't loud. Just a little sound, like a slipper falling, then footsteps. Poirot narrowed his eyes. Were the doors locked? I don't know. I just buried myself under the covers. Mr. Hobday, the gardener, sat uncomfortably as the final interview began. I ain't seen nothing, sir. I was long home by 7. Never go in the house after dark. I don't like the way it smells. Jap arched a brow. The way it smells. Hobday shifted. Like lavender and money. Makes my head ache. Poirot did not smile. That is the most honest thing anyone has said this morning, monsieur. When the interviews concluded, Poirot and Jap stood alone in the study once more. Well? Jap asked, folding his arms. Anything catch your fancy? Poirot looked out the window at the dripping hedges. Yes, mon ami. Several things. A missing key, a dead girl in disguise, a stepson who quotes disdain instead of grief, a doctor who is too familiar, and most of all, he turned, a house where everyone insists they heard nothing, yet something, quelque chose, was heard by the one person considered least reliable. Jap nodded. The scullery maid. Just so. She is young, and she fears being blamed. But she has told us the truth. Poirot's voice lowered, and someone in this house fears the truth more than anything. He glanced once more at the crime scene. Jap, let us summon Dr. Bexley tomorrow morning. I believe he is overdue for his own examination. The following morning, just after 10, Hercule Poirot stood precisely centered on the Persian rug in Sir Horace Kellam's study, the scene of the strange double death. Though Scotland Yard had already scoured the room, Poirot moved through it with a different energy, not searching, but noticing. He examined not the objects themselves, but their placement. The tassel on the left curtain pulled half an inch higher than the right, the ink blotter slightly askew from its tray, the poker beside the fireplace not fully aligned, each detail a whisper, and Poirot listened as though the room itself wished to confess. Japp entered briskly, shaking off the mist from his coat. Bexley's in the drawing-room, surprised but not shaken. I don't like that man. Poirot turned slowly. No, because he is not a man one instinctively suspects. But I have found, mon ami, that sometimes the quiet ones are not so quiet behind closed doors. Together they walked to the drawing-room where Dr. Felix Bexley, a well-groomed man in his 50s, waited near the fireplace. His manner was smooth, practiced. He greeted Poirot with a polite nod and a firm handshake. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, it is an honor. I've read your work in the Journal of Applied Criminology. I assume this is no ordinary house call." "Indeed not," Poirot said, sitting opposite him. "2 deaths in one night, Doctor. One expected if age and tension be factored. The other, unexplainable." Bexley adjusted his cuffs. "Lady Kellam asked me here the evening before last. Sir Horace had been restless, irritable. Nothing alarming, but he wanted advice on his blood pressure medication." "Was he alone with you?" Japp asked. "For a time. Charles came in briefly. Otherwise, it was just Sir Horace and I." "Did he mention anything unusual?" Poirot asked, watching the doctor's response. Bexley's expression didn't flicker. He was preoccupied, yes. Not anxious. More annoyed. I presumed it was domestic. "Did he mention a new maid?" "Not a word. But then, Horace was not involved in household minutiae." Poirot steepled his fingers. "Doctor, forgive me, but how long have you been attending to the Kellam family?" "Over a decade. I treated Lady Kellam during her nervous exhaustion after the war, and later advised Sir Horace on diet and aging." "You are practically family, then?" Bexley gave a small smile. "They'd never say so aloud, but yes, I've been to this house more times than I can count." Poirot nodded, then rose. "Merci, Doctor. You are most helpful." As Bexley left, Japp leaned in. Too smooth by half, but nothing concrete. Poirot gestured for Japp to follow him upstairs. "Come, let us revisit the domestic quarters. There is still something out of balance here." On the 3rd floor, the servants' wing stretched in narrow, dimly lit corridors. Mrs. Drummond accompanied them with a candle, explaining the arrangement. "This is where Elsie and the other maids sleep. The empty room at the end was last used 3 months ago. We haven't had a new maid since then." Poirot paused before the empty room. He stepped in. Dust coated the surfaces undisturbed, except for the bed frame, which bore a faint impression, and the corner of the rug, which had been tugged half a foot askew. Poirot knelt. Beneath the rug, a hairpin. He lifted it carefully. "A woman has been here," he said softly, "and she tried to cover her presence." Mrs. Drummond looked horrified. "But no one sleeps here. The linen is never changed." "Exactly," Poirot said. "And yet it was slept in recently. So she was not just here to die. She stayed. She planned." They returned to the study. Poirot stared once more at the ornate writing desk. What if she came to meet Sir Horace? Not to harm him, but to confront him. "About what?" Japp asked. Poirot opened the drawer. Inside, neatly stacked, were personal papers, letters, ledgers, a cheque-book. But tucked between them was a folded letter with no envelope. The handwriting was neat, feminine. Poirot read silently, his eyes narrowing. "Sir, I have waited too long for you to acknowledge me. I do not seek fortune, only truth. You know who I am. I shall come to you, and you will see my face at last." "E.M." Poirot handed it to Japp. "We have our girl's initials. We have motive, not robbery, but identity. This girl came not to deceive, but to be seen. Japp frowned. You think she was related to Sir Horace? Poirot's voice was low. Bien sûr. A daughter, perhaps illegitimate. The timing, the secrecy, the choice of dress. It all points to someone trying to blend in, to reach a man powerful enough to ignore her. She posed as a maid to infiltrate the household, perhaps even stayed hidden for days. But then, she is found dead beside him. And now, both are silent. At that moment, a constable entered the study. Sir, we've received a call. A young woman, Edith Marsh, was reported missing 2 days ago by her landlady in Clerkenwell. Her mother passed away last year. No known father listed. 23 years old. Employed part-time in a dressmaker's shop. Poirot nodded slowly. The initials match, the age matches, and the motive becomes clear. Japp scratched his chin. So she comes here, confronts him, something goes wrong, and he kills her. But then who kills him? Poirot raised a finger. Non, non, non. That is the mistake. You assume the deaths are directly linked. But observe. No signs of struggle, no blood spatter but a single blow, no defensive wounds. It was too quiet. He stepped to the fire and adjusted the poker ever so slightly. She came to speak. Perhaps she threatened exposure. Or perhaps Sir Horace was overwhelmed. But if he struck her, he did so in a panic. And then, someone else silenced him. Japp's brow furrowed. Someone who didn't want the truth to come out. Poirot tapped the edge of the desk. Or someone with more to lose than either of them. A silence fell between them. Poirot turned to the window. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained the color of slate. Now, Japp, we must look not at who had reason to kill Sir Horace, but at who had reason to prevent Edith Marsh from being heard. Poirot looked again at the uniform cap. She didn't work here, but she knew how to act like she did, and that is not something one learns from imagination alone. Someone instructed her, someone inside. Japp looked grim. You think there's a conspirator? Poirot's voice hardened. I think there is a teacher, and perhaps an inheritor. He turned toward the hallway where footsteps echoed faintly. Call Charles Kellum back in. I wish to ask him about a check his stepfather never signed, and about a girl named Edith, whom he very likely met before her arrival in uniform. Charles Kellum returned to the study with an expression hovering between irritation and forced politeness. He adjusted his cuffs as he entered, wearing the same navy blazer from the day before, and greeted Poirot with a tight nod. You wanted to speak to me again, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot gestured toward the chair opposite the fireplace. Mais oui. I regret the intrusion, but there are certain inconsistencies which require your personal insight. Monsieur Kellum, please sit. Charles obeyed with visible reluctance, crossing his legs and folding his arms. Japp leaned against the door, arms also folded, but less elegantly. Poirot held up the letter found in Sir Horace's drawer. Do you recognize the handwriting? Charles gave it a cursory glance and shook his head. No, should I? Poirot's tone remained pleasant, but precise. That depends. You see, this young woman, Edith Marsh, is not simply a stranger in a maid's uniform. She was last seen 3 days ago in Clerkenwell. Her initials match those sewn into the cap she wore. And this letter, written with trembling dignity, implies she believes Sir Horace was her father. Charles's brow arched slightly. That's quite the accusation. No, it is her belief, but here is where I seek clarity. Would you be so kind, monsieur, as to explain why your name appears on a partial check stub in Sir Horace's checkbook? A check dated 2 weeks ago, but never completed nor torn out. Charles shifted. My stepfather had promised to fund a property I was interested in, a gallery space in Mayfair. He changed his mind at the last minute. Poirot nodded slowly. Curious. And when did he inform you of this change? A few days before his death. Did he give a reason? Charles hesitated. Said he was revising his will. Said I needed to earn his investment. Did that upset you? Charles smirked, though there was no humor in it. He enjoyed withholding. He called it teaching lessons in character. Oui. And this was before or after you became acquainted with Miss Edith Marsh? The question landed like a stone in a still pond. Charles's eyes narrowed. I've never met her. Poirot tilted his head. Strange. Her landlady recalled her receiving flowers 2 weeks ago. White lilies, from a Mr. K. She could not remember the first name. Charles's foot began tapping. Coincidence? Perhaps. But also curious that Miss Marsh began inquiring about Sir Horace's connections around the same time, specifically asking at St. Aldwyn's registry about any confidential records related to paternity acknowledgements. Someone warned her off. A man, tall, fair, fashionable. Japp stepped forward. You fit that description, Charles. Were you keeping tabs on her? Charles stood abruptly. This is absurd. You're twisting facts to suit a theory. I want a solicitor. Poirot remained seated, calm as ever. That is your right, monsieur, but be assured, we are not accusing. We are observing, and it seems you have been more involved in this girl's life than you wish us to believe. Charles stormed out without another word. Japp shook his head. He's hiding something. Question is, was it guilt or self-preservation? Poirot turned back to the desk and gently tapped the glass inkwell. He fears exposure, not discovery. There is a difference. Later that afternoon, Poirot requested Mrs. Drummond return. She arrived clutching a bundle of linen in her arms. I thought you might want this, sir, she said. It's from the empty servant room. I changed the sheets myself this morning after you pointed out the bed had been slept in. This was the pillowcase. Poirot examined it carefully. Along one edge, a faint smear of powder, not dust, clung to the fabric. He sniffed it. A light scent of lavender talc. Cheap, nothing like Lady Kellam's imported perfumes. Beneath it, a hair, long and dark. He nodded. She stayed here, yes. But she did not simply sneak in. She had help. Someone gave her the uniform, told her which corridors were watched, and ensured she was not seen. Mrs. Drummond's eyes filled. You think someone here aided her? I think someone here owed her something, or feared what she knew. As Mrs. Drummond left, Poirot turned to Japp. Now we speak with Lady Kellam again, but this time we ask the questions beneath the surface. Lady Kellam was seated in the blue salon, sipping her afternoon tea. When Poirot entered, she gestured toward the armchair across from her, poised as though she were entertaining an old friend rather than assisting a murder inquiry. You're back again, Monsieur Poirot. I assume you've uncovered something dreadful. Not dreadful, madame. Revealing. I wish to ask you about your husband's early business years. She set down her cup. Horace built his empire before we met. We married in 1914, the week before the war. Was there ever mention of a woman named Anne Marsh? Lady Kellam went still. Then she reached for her pearls and adjusted them slowly. I've heard the name. Long ago. He employed her briefly, before the war. She was a typist in his office. Pretty, I believe. And dismissed? Rather suddenly. I assumed it was for impropriety. I never asked. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Did you know she bore a child? I suspected, but Horace was never confronted. He handled such matters discreetly. Poirot nodded. And yet the past does not remain buried, madame. It walks, sometimes in the form of a maid no one remembers hiring. She inhaled sharply. Then the girl, she was that child? We believe so. Her name was Edith Marsh, and she came here not to steal, not to serve, but to be heard. Lady Kellam pressed her handkerchief to her lips. My God, and now she's dead, and Horace is dead. Poirot stood. Indeed, but one did not kill the other. That, madame, I'm quite certain of. As he left the salon, Poirot paused at the staircase, looking up toward the servant quarters. His mind worked silently, the facts arranging themselves. A hidden daughter, a family secret, a young man with a lost inheritance, a household of eyes trained to overlook what did not belong, and someone within, who silenced the truth before it could be spoken aloud. He returned to the study just before dusk, the light outside dimming to orange. Japp waited near the mantel. Well, Poirot spoke softly. We now know who she was, but not why she died. That answer is locked in fear, not malice. Fear, and we must pry it free gently. Tomorrow, Japp, we bring back the entire household, one by one, not for questions, but for contradictions. Japp looked confused. What do you mean? Poirot smiled faintly. It is not what they tell us, it is what they told each other. We have not yet let them speak in front of one another. That is where the truth begins to leak. And les petites contradictions, they will shout louder than any confession. He tapped the edge of the desk once more. Also, we must examine the uniform, not just the name stitched in it, but the hands that stitched it, for that was no random acquisition. That uniform came from this house. The morning sun cast a dull silver light over Belgrave Square as Hercule Poirot returned to number 43. Umbrella tucked neatly beneath his arm, his hat immaculate as always. Inside, the air was taut. The household staff had been summoned to the drawing room once again, but this time not for formal interviews. They were simply asked to be present. Poirot paced slowly before the fireplace, his eyes touching each face with surgical focus. I thank you all for returning, he said, clasping his hands. We are no longer investigating a mystery of identity. We now know the young woman who died was named Edith Marsh. We know she posed as a maid and that she stayed, briefly, within this house. What we do not know, yet, is how she died, and why Sir Horace Kellam followed her in death so soon after. Nervous glances passed between the servants. Charles stood near the window, arms crossed, avoiding his mother's eyes. Lady Kellam sat rigid in an armchair, lips drawn tight. Poirot continued, But now, I must draw your attention to something small, seemingly trivial. The maid's uniform Miss Marsh wore. It was not hired, it was not stolen, it was prepared. The stitching, the seams, the insignia, identical to those used by this household. Someone here provided it. A gasp came from Elsie, the young scullery maid. She stepped backward instinctively, then covered her mouth. Poirot turned to her gently. Mademoiselle, did you make her uniform? Elsie shook her head furiously. No, sir, I didn't, but I think I know who might have. Every head turned. Japp stepped forward. Speak plainly, girl. Elsie glanced toward the housekeeper, then at the valet. I was down in the laundry room one afternoon, just after the Kellams hosted that charity dinner. I heard Mrs. Drummond arguing with someone. Not loudly, just tight voices. I didn't catch everything, but she said something like, You shouldn't have promised her anything. Poirot turned slowly to Mrs. Drummond, whose mouth had dropped open. That's ridiculous, she said, pale. She must have misunderstood. I've been under pressure. I raise my voice often. But promises? To whom? A stranger? Poirot walked forward, speaking calmly. The room where Edith stayed had its linen changed after the body was found. That linen was taken by you, madame, and the pillow held lavender talc that matched your personal sachets. You did not offer it knowingly, perhaps, but you cleaned her trail. Why? Mrs. Drummond trembled slightly. I didn't realize it was hers. I thought it had been used by one of the new hires. There were no new hires, Japp said sharply. Poirot stepped closer. The truth, madame. You knew her. Perhaps not intimately, but you helped her. Why? There was a long pause. Finally, her voice, broke. She came to the back door a week before it happened. Said she wanted to speak to Sir Horace. I turned her away. She came again. Said she was his daughter. I didn't believe her, but she looked so desperate. Polite, calm. Not mad like some of them. I told her to go. But she returned, Poirot said softly. Yes, and she had a uniform. I don't know how she got it, I swear. She told me she just needed a place to rest. She said she wouldn't be seen, that she'd speak to him and leave. She begged me not to tell the others. I thought if I kept it quiet, it would pass. Jap was furious. You harbored an intruder in a murder scene. Mrs. Drummond cried out. She wasn't dangerous. She was kind, soft-spoken. I didn't think... I thought she'd just have her say and vanish. Poirot raised a hand. This is what I needed, madame. Not blame. Only clarity. You were the bridge between the house and the girl, and I believe she trusted you. Mrs. Drummond nodded. Broken. I let her down. Poirot turned away and walked to the center of the room. Now, let us address the obvious. His eyes found Charles again. You claimed not to know her, yet she received lilies from a man using only the initial K. She lived near a place you visited frequently, an art dealer in Clerkenwell, and your bank card was used at a cafe 3 doors down 2 weeks ago. I checked. Charles glared. You've been watching me. Poirot's tone was smooth. Observing. Your pattern, monsieur, suggests you had contact with her, possibly brief, possibly longer, but you knew. Charles stood his ground. I may have met her once. She came to a gallery opening, asked about my family, claimed she was a fan of my photography. She was lying, clearly. I brushed her off. Yet she wrote a letter to your stepfather shortly after, Poirot replied. She believed she had been acknowledged. What did you tell her? Charles' voice grew cold. I told her not to come near this house again, that my stepfather would never accept her. I thought she'd disappear. I didn't think she'd show up here. Poirot studied him a moment longer. Then he turned to Jap. A lie hidden behind a shield of pride, not unusual in families with titles. Jap nodded. So Charles warned her off. She came anyway, spoke to Sir Horace. Poirot held up a finger. No, that is where you are wrong, mon ami. She never spoke to him. Silence. Lady Kellam stood. What are you saying? Poirot moved slowly to the study door. Sir Horace was in his chair, the girl seated beside him, dead, hands folded, no signs of struggle. Sir Horace did not kill her. He found her. Jap's eyes narrowed. Then what? Poirot's voice was firm. Edith Marsh took her own life. Gasps filled the room. Even Charles looked stunned. Poirot continued. She came here for acceptance, for acknowledgement. She waited, unseen. Perhaps she left the letter in his study and hid, hoping he would call for her. But when the moment never came, when he remained silent or refused to face her, she saw no path forward. Lady Kellam whispered, She poisoned herself. No, Poirot said. I believe she took sleeping draughts, enough to slow the heart. Then she sat beside him as though daring him to see her. And he was so wrapped in his paper, in his pride, that he never even noticed. By the time he turned, she was gone. Jap looked shaken. And then, Poirot's face hardened. Then he panicked, not from guilt, but from reputation, and someone saw that panic, someone who feared what this truth could unleash, the will, the inheritance, the shame. And they struck, Jap said grimly. So Sir Horace was murdered, but not by Edith. Exactly. Poirot turned back to the room. We have been chasing one killer, but there are 2 stories here. Hers is a tragedy, his a crime. And now we must separate pity from motive, for the person who struck Sir Horace did so with cold blood. He looked around at the faces again, and they are in this room. The drawing room emptied slowly after Poirot's revelation. No one argued, but the weight of the words, "She took her own life," left the air heavy with unease. The household dispersed, each member now aware that one truth had been uncovered, but the true danger still walked among them. Only Poirot and Japp remained behind, standing beneath the ticking mantel clock, which now struck 12 noon. "She didn't kill him. She died beside him, quietly, unnoticed," Japp said in a low voice. It's tragic." Poirot nodded. "Oui. She did not want revenge. She wanted recognition. She came hoping to be seen, and when she was not, she faded. A quiet, final defiance." He stepped toward the center of the room. "But Sir Horace, he died violently. That is what the killer cannot hide. That is what they will answer for." Poirot began a new game, not with questions, but with behavior. He knew now that truth would not come from more interrogation. The killer was no fool. They would remain guarded, precise. So Poirot chose to disturb their balance, to make them slip. That afternoon, he had the household staff gather once more, only this time in the dining hall, not the study. A subtle change, but a significant one. He instructed that the chairs be rearranged. Charles was placed directly opposite Mrs. Drummond. Lady Kellam sat beside Elsie, Mr. Sturgis, the valet, beside Charles. Everyone noticed, though no one commented. Poirot stood behind the chair at the head of the table, unseated, and began to speak as though casually recounting events. "We now understand Edith Marsh came here with hope. She was failed by those who should have protected her. That much, I think, is beyond question. But someone here, someone, took advantage of the chaos that followed her death. They struck Sir Horace and made it seem as though he collapsed from shock. But a man does not fall forward cleanly after a blow to the temple. A man struck from behind would slump unnaturally. And yet Sir Horace was seated, his head bowed, his tea untouched." Poirot paused. "Whoever killed him entered that study after Edith had already passed. That person saw not just a dead girl, but an opportunity to end Sir Horace before he changed his mind, before he adjusted his will." All eyes shifted instinctively toward Charles. Poirot noticed, but said nothing. He continued, "There are those among us who stood to gain from Sir Horace's silence, or from Edith remaining forgotten. The inheritance, the scandal, the perception of weakness. These things matter very much to those who live by reputation." Lady Kellam sipped her tea. "You're circling, Monsieur Poirot. Are you accusing my son?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Madame, I accuse no one. I merely observe how certain truths make some people flinch and others freeze. That is always more revealing than answers." He turned to Mr. Sturgis, the valet. "You are a man of precision, monsieur. A man who notices patterns. Tell me, did Sir Horace ever alter his routine?" Sturgis straightened. "Rarely. His day began at 7, ended at 10. Tea was served at the same hour. Even his socks were rotated by color. Then surely you would know if anything was out of place that evening." Sturgis hesitated. "I did find his tea untouched, and he was wearing his Monday slippers on a Thursday. That was strange." Poirot nodded with genuine interest. "A man so precise does not make such errors, unless he did not dress himself." The room went still. Mrs. Drummond dropped her spoon. Japp looked up. "You're saying someone redressed him after death?" "Possibly," Poirot said, turning. "Or someone brought him the wrong pair and he never had the chance to object. A small detail, but details matter." Elsie spoke up quietly. "Miss Marsh. She asked me where the tea service was stored. I didn't think anything of it. I thought she was new and just nervous." Poirot turned to her gently. "You saw her before she died?" Elsie nodded. "Only once. A glimpse. She was carrying a tray, but she wasn't heading toward the kitchen. She was going upstairs." Poirot's brow furrowed slightly. "Upstairs. To the master bedroom," Elsie said. I remember because she looked lost. I told her, "The study's down the other hall." She nodded, turned back. That was it. Poirot glanced at Jap. She tried to find him earlier. Perhaps he wasn't there. Perhaps he never saw her before she died. Charles stood abruptly. "What does any of this prove?" "You've got nothing. This is just theatre." Poirot nodded slowly. "But the theatre, monsieur, reveals far more than the script. It reveals how the audience reacts. For example, why such defensiveness when your name has not been spoken in accusation today?" Charles said nothing. Poirot approached the fireplace and picked up a small poker, the same one used to strike Sir Horace. He turned it in his hands and walked over to Lady Kellam. "Madame, you were in your room at the time of Sir Horace's death, yes?" "I was, as I said before." "You heard nothing? No sound, no disturbance?" "No." Poirot tilted his head. "But this house echoes, madame. I stood in the corridor outside your room. I heard Jap cough from the study. A blow, such as this poker delivered, would ring through the wood panels." Lady Kellam stiffened. "I had taken something to sleep." "Ah," Poirot said. "And yet you woke quickly when the butler found the body." "I'm a light sleeper." Poirot smiled faintly. "Except when you are not." She stood. "Monsieur Poirot, if you have an accusation, make it." "Non, madame, not yet. The truth is not yet ripe." He gestured toward Jap. "But we are nearly there. There is only one final matter. The document that Sir Horace began drafting, a revision to his will. It was never filed. But it exists." Jap nodded. "We found fragments in the fireplace, half-burned." Poirot turned to the room. It left behind only one word: daughter. Everyone was silent. Poirot's voice lowered. Sir Horace had begun the process of legal recognition. He intended to acknowledge Edith Marsh formally. He had changed his mind. He was no longer afraid, and someone read that draft before he could finish it. Someone who knew that if Edith's name was inked into the will, everything would change. Poirot walked to the center of the room, looking at each face. The killer is not the one who feared Edith. It is the one who feared what she represented: legitimacy, change, scandal, and a share of everything Sir Horace built. His eyes settled on one figure. "And I believe that person never left this house after the murder. They remained. They watched us. And now they tremble." He turned to Jap. "Tomorrow I will call everyone back, not for questions, for reconstruction. We shall walk the steps Edith took. We shall trace Sir Horace's final moments. And someone will fail to keep their story straight." Poirot bowed slightly. "And then, my friend, we shall know everything." The following morning broke over London with a steel-colored sky and a biting wind. At number 43 Belgrave Square, the household assembled once more, not by choice, but by necessity. Poirot had requested they all gather in the study precisely at 8 o'clock. None dared refuse. When they arrived, they found the study transformed. Poirot had repositioned the chairs to match their exact locations on the night of Sir Horace's death. The tea tray had been replicated, right down to the half-eaten biscuit and folded newspaper. On the armchair rested a coat that once belonged to the Laitue's magnate, placed with eerie familiarity. The air in the room felt heavy, as if the walls remembered too well. Poirot stood by the fireplace, gazing down at the cold hearth, hands behind his back. "Mes amis, today we do not speculate. We retrace. We shall see, not imagine, what occurred. You will each play your part, not in pretense, but in position. We begin with Edith Marsh." He turned to Elsie, the youngest maid, and handed her the maid's cap once worn by the deceased. "You saw her carry the tea tray that night, did you not?" Elsie nodded hesitantly. "Yes, sir, around 10. She was headed toward the master bedroom at first, but turned back when I told her the study was down the other way." "Très bien. Then please, Take the tray again and walk exactly as you saw her walk." Elsie obeyed. She carried the tray from the corridor to the door of the study, entered quietly, and paused in front of the armchair. The silence returned, pressing down like a weight. "She sat here, beside Sir Horace," Poirot said. "She waited. She hoped. And then she swallowed a fatal dose. Likely from a bottle hidden in her apron, one we still have not recovered." He turned to the others. "Now, each of you, where were you at this moment? Between 10 and 11. They repeated the familiar answers. Lady Kellam in her room, Charles reading in the lounge, Mrs. Drummond in the kitchen, Sturgis attending to silverware, Elsie in bed. Poirot walked slowly to the tea tray. He lifted the cup that had been recreated by his request. Edith's cup contained traces of a sedative. Not uncommon. But what caught my attention was the spoon. Stirred with the left hand. Yet she was right-handed, as noted from the writing in her letter. "Curious, no?" Japp stepped in. "So someone else stirred the cup." Poirot nodded. "Indeed. Someone who added the sedative. Someone who did not trust Edith to die alone." Lady Kellam gasped. "You mean she was helped?" "No, madame. I mean she was insured." Poirot turned to the room. "I now believe that Edith intended to frighten her father into recognition. But the dose she took was not fatal. Not immediately. She would have become drowsy, compliant. Someone saw their moment and deepened the dose. Slipped something extra into her cup." Charles looked up sharply. "That's absurd." Poirot fixed his eyes on him. "Is it? And yet when we found her, her hands were folded. Her expression was calm, but no glass, no bottle, only the cup. Someone finished what she began." He paused, allowing the tension to build. "And this someone remained nearby, possibly waiting for Sir Horace to respond. But he did not panic. He did not scream. He simply froze. And then, realizing what had happened, realizing what she was and what she wanted, he may have decided finally to grant her wish. He reached for the letter, for his pen, to write her name." Poirot stepped to the desk and lifted the charred edge of a document preserved from the fireplace. But he was too late. The killer struck before the ink dried. The silence that followed was broken not by a gasp, but by the shriek of Mrs. Drummond outside in the hall. Poirot and Japp rushed out. They found her standing beside the linen cupboard, face pale, lips trembling. "There's something in there," she cried, "in the laundry bag." Poirot gestured for Japp to open it. Inside, amidst crumpled sheets and towels, was a small glass vial, its label half scratched off, but clearly readable. Laudanum. Caution. Lethal in excess. Japp whistled. "Well, that solves the missing poison question." Poirot turned to the housekeeper. "Who else has access to this cupboard?" "Everyone. It's just the laundry drop. We collect it once a day." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "And who washed the sheets from the unused servant room?" Mrs. Drummond stammered. I did, myself." Poirot said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to Japp. "We must check for fingerprints on the bottle. If the killer was careless, we may finally have something solid." But it wasn't the bottle that brought the next revelation. That night, Poirot remained at the house well past midnight. He sat alone in the study, reviewing notes by lamplight. Just after 1 o'clock, the door creaked open and Mr. Sturgis, the valet, stepped in quietly. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "I couldn't sleep. There's something I've not said. Not because I meant to deceive, but because I wasn't sure it mattered." Poirot gestured for him to sit. "I saw someone enter the study just after 11 that night," Sturgis said. "I was polishing in the hallway. They were quick, silent. But I recognized the jacket." Poirot leaned forward. "Whose jacket, Mr. Sturgis?" There was a long pause. "Charles Kellam's." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "You are certain?" "Yes, It's the cream herringbone, custom cut. He wore it to the gallery auction last month. Hard to miss. Poirot rose. Why did you not say this before? Because if I was wrong, I'd be accusing a man of murder. But I'm not wrong. Poirot pressed a hand to his temple. Enfin. At last, a mistake. The killer returned. He assumed no one was watching, but he forgot. The staff do not sleep when the rich believe they do. Poirot thanked Sturgis and waited until he had gone. Then he walked slowly to the fireplace and stared into the cold grate. This was not a murder of rage, nor one of passion. It was convenience. Sir Horace was going to change everything, and Charles, he could not risk it. The next morning, Poirot stood before Japp in the yard. We have our moment, mon ami. Tomorrow, we gather them once more, not to question, but to accuse. Japp nodded grimly. And the proof? Poirot smiled. Mais oui. We have the coat, the cup, the letter, the vial, and now the witness. He straightened his cuffs. Now we arrange our theatre. The final act begins. The study was quiet again. A strange calm had settled over number 43 Belgrave Square, a calm born not of peace, but of approaching judgment. Hercule Poirot sat alone that afternoon, his fingers tracing the edge of the half-burned will fragment like a man reading Braille. Around him, objects were no longer just things. They were witnesses. The glass vial, the folded maid's uniform, the letter signed E.M. And now, the unspoken testimony of a man who had served silently for decades. Sturgis. Poirot closed his eyes and leaned back in the chair Sir Horace had once occupied. What had the man been thinking in his final hour? Had he looked upon Edith and felt guilt, regret, recognition, or simply irritation at an inconvenient truth returning? Poirot did not need Sir Horace to speak. The truth now resided in the overlooked, the ordinary, the out of place. He stood and moved toward the coat rack near the door. Most of the garments had been removed for evidence, but one item remained, a cream herringbone jacket with custom buttons. Charles Kellam's, the very one Sturgis had identified during his late-night confession. Poirot removed the jacket carefully, laying it flat on the study table. He examined each seam, each cuff, each pocket. In the right inner pocket, he found what he expected, a torn corner of parchment, lightweight, ivory, and faintly scented with lavender. He lifted it with tweezers. It matched exactly the edge of the letter from Edith Marsh. Ah, he whispered. So, you took it from her, but not before you read it. He turned the slip over. On it were 5 words, scrawled hastily in pencil. You are no better than him. Poirot stared at the sentence for a long time. The pronoun him. Surely it referred to Sir Horace. But you? That had been meant for Charles. She had confronted him after all. That changed everything. Poirot stepped back, eyes narrowing. He imagined it now, in full. Edith Marsh, drugged but coherent, confronting Charles in the dim hallway outside the study. He'd promised her silence, perhaps even sympathy, but when she showed him the letter, her father's promise to amend the will, Charles understood the threat, not only to the inheritance, but to the myth of their family's respectability. He'd taken the letter, ripped it, poisoned her tea, waited. Then, when Sir Horace began to act, when he began to write, Charles struck. Not out of rage, but to preserve the lie. Poirot turned suddenly to the far wall where a large framed photograph of the Kellam estate hung. Something had nagged at him for days about it. Now, he stepped close. The photo showed Sir Horace with a young Charles, both standing on the steps of a country manor, but in the lower corner, hardly noticeable, was a young woman in a housemaid's uniform, caught mid-step. She had the same jawline as Edith. Poirot smiled faintly. Not Anne Marsh. That's Edith. She was here before, years ago. She worked here, briefly. She wasn't lying. He removed the photograph from the wall. Behind it, tucked into the wooden backing, was a folded page. It was yellowed with age, but intact. Another letter, this one signed Anne Marsh. Horace, I will not trouble you again, but I have placed our daughter in your household, as you once said she might earn her place. Her name is Edith. She is discreet. She does not know the truth yet, but she will. I am done hiding for you. Poirot replaced the photograph slowly. He stood in silence, his thoughts aligning like chess pieces before checkmate. Anne Marsh had placed Edith in the Kellam household years ago, likely as a maid. Sir Horace dismissed her. Perhaps Charles recognized her later, perhaps not immediately, but eventually. But Edith had always known where she belonged, and when she returned, she did so not out of vengeance, but conviction. Poirot now had all the pieces. Edith's presence years before, her return as a maid, her letter to her father, the confrontation with Charles, the missing bottle, the herringbone jacket, the slip of paper, the handwriting, the final insult. Now he only needed one final reaction. That evening he invited Charles Kellam back to the study, alone. Charles entered with less confidence than before. His jacket was gone. His gaze shifted to the photograph that now hung slightly askew. You wanted to see me? Poirot gestured to the desk. Please. Sit. Charles obeyed. Poirot placed the torn note on the table. Do you recognize this? Charles stared. No, but it was in your jacket. I don't know how it got there. Poirot nodded calmly. That jacket was also seen by Sturgis, worn by the man who entered the study after Sir Horace dismissed the staff, the same man who left no fingerprints on the poker, but wiped it with a handkerchief. Poirot lifted another evidence bag. This handkerchief, monogrammed C.K. Charles looked away. Poirot continued, and this, he held up the photograph, shows your stepfather with a housemaid in the corner, the same maid you claimed you'd never met. Yet she worked in this house once, long ago, quiet, unnoticed, until she returned. Charles stood abruptly. You think I killed them both? No. I think you killed one and buried the truth of the other. You did not make her take the laudanum, but you made sure it finished her, because you could not let her speak. Charles' voice rose. You have no proof. Poirot walked to the fireplace and placed the slip of paper into the flames. It curled, blackened, and vanished. I have enough. The rest is conscience. And I believe, Monsieur Kellam, you have just enough of one left to feel it. Charles stared at the fire. For a moment, Poirot thought he might speak, but instead he turned and left the room without a word. Japp stepped in from the side room. You think he'll crack? Poirot adjusted his cuffs. No, I think he already has. It is not the gallows he fears, it is the disgrace, and men like Charles fear that more than death. He tapped the mantelpiece once. We have our killer, Japp. And now we assemble everyone, one final time. I shall speak, they shall listen, and the truth at last shall be complete. The drawing room of number 43 Belgrave Square was unusually still. At precisely 11 o'clock, as requested, the entire household assembled for what everyone knew was the final act. Lady Kellam sat nearest the fire, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Drummond looked pale, her hands wringing the same lace handkerchief over and over. Elsie and Mr. Hobday stood awkwardly by the door. Mr. Sturgis waited silently, arms behind his back. Charles Kellam entered last, face blank, and took his place near the far window, keeping his distance from everyone. Japp stood by the door, notebook in hand, but he made no move to speak. It was Poirot who took center stage, standing with his back to the fire, his gaze sweeping slowly across the faces before him. Mesdames et messieurs, You have been most patient. You have answered questions, endured suspicion, and watched a quiet tragedy unfold within your walls. But now, the moment has come to put every piece in its place. As always, it is not the facts that solve the case. It is their arrangement. He moved to the table, where a few items had been laid out. A torn letter, a maid's cap, a small vial, and a poker wrapped in cloth. "We begin," Poirot said softly, "with Edith Marsh, a name that meant nothing to most of you until last week. But to Sir Horace Kellam, it was a name long buried, a consequence of a decision made before he married Lady Kellam, a child born of a liaison with Anne Marsh, a woman he discarded with characteristic convenience." Lady Kellam stirred but said nothing. Poirot continued, "Years later, Edith Marsh returned to this house, not out of revenge but out of hope. She wanted recognition, she wanted to be acknowledged, and she believed, perhaps foolishly, that if she approached her father quietly, in service rather than confrontation, she might receive it." He gestured toward the maid's cap. "She came disguised, but she did not sneak. She entered with help. Mrs. Drummond." The housekeeper flinched. "You gave her a place to sleep. Perhaps you pitied her. Perhaps you believed it would pass quickly. You underestimated how deeply a child craves truth." Mrs. Drummond's voice cracked. "I didn't think she'd die." "No," Poirot said gently. "You thought it would resolve itself. But it did not." He turned to the others. "Now, you have all heard that Edith took her own life, and it is true to a point. She took laudanum, perhaps intending only to render herself calm, compliant, impossible to ignore. But what she did not know was that someone else had another plan." He pointed to the vial. "This was found hidden in the laundry, wiped clean, but not clean enough. A faint fingerprint remained. Charles, you told us you never touched this girl, never met her, but your fingerprint says otherwise." Charles tensed. "She slipped it into my jacket. She was playing games, trying to blackmail me." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, so now you admit you knew her?" Silence. "Very well, let us follow the sequence. Edith writes a letter to Sir Horace. She slips it into his study. She prepares herself and waits. But before she can be seen, you intercept her. You read the letter. You see what your stepfather is planning. A change to his will. A threat to everything you consider yours." Poirot lifted the torn fragment from the desk. "You ripped it. You tried to reason with her. You failed. She drank the laudanum, and then you ensured it worked. You added more, enough to end her life." Charles exhaled through his nose. "You have no proof I did?" Poirot nodded. "No direct proof, only the uniform she wore, which she could not have obtained without someone's assistance. The precise method of poisoning, identical to what was once used in a failed suicide attempt, yours 3 years ago, when your debts were called in. You recovered, but you knew the dosage. You remembered." Charles's expression faltered. Japp stiffened. Poirot turned now to the fireplace. "Then comes Sir Horace. He finds her dead, the girl he ignored, the daughter he dismissed. And finally, he prepares to act. He begins rewriting his will, not from guilt, but perhaps clarity. Age has a way of forcing reflection." Poirot retrieved the half-burned page. "This is all that remained, the word daughter. And you, Charles, you panicked. You waited until the house slept. Then you returned. You struck him from behind. One clean blow." He pointed to the poker. "No fingerprints, but Mr. Sturgis saw the cream herringbone jacket you wore that night. He recognized it. You changed clothes before the body was found. You placed yourself at a distance, but we were always circling back." Charles said nothing. Poirot stepped forward slowly. "You are not a monster, monsieur. But you are a coward. You feared scandal more than justice. You feared poverty more than shame. And so you created a lie." He turned now to the entire room. Edith Marsh did not die in vain. Her story was not forgotten. Her voice was not silenced. She was never just the maid who didn't work here. She was the daughter who did. Lady Kellam spoke at last, her voice thin. And now? Poirot looked at Japp. Now, La Justice, Mr. Kellam will be taken into custody. The Crown will decide the rest. Japp nodded and moved toward Charles. The younger man did not resist. He stood, said nothing, and allowed the constable waiting outside to escort him away. As the door closed behind him, the room fell silent again. Poirot turned to the fire and stood there a long moment before speaking one final time. This house was built on appearance, but appearance deceives. Beneath the surface was a woman cast out, a daughter denied, and a man whose silence cost 2 lives, his own and hers. He turned to Mrs. Drummond. "You were kind, too late. But you were kind." Then to Elsie. "You were honest, even when afraid." Then to Lady Kellam. "And you, madame, you protected a name. But in the end, names mean little when the truth is ignored." With that, Poirot retrieved his coat and hat. As he stepped out into the morning fog, Japp followed beside him. "You never did say what gave it away." Poirot smiled. A cup stirred with the wrong hand, a jacket worn on the wrong night, a name hidden behind the wrong silence. The rest, mon ami, was only deduction. The drawing room was nearly empty now. Charles Kellam had been escorted out under formal arrest. The household staff had dispersed, each to their rooms or duties, heavy with the shock of truth. Only Poirot and Lady Kellam remained, seated across from one another in silence. The fire crackled between them, the only sound in a house that had held too many secrets for too long. Lady Kellam broke the silence at last. "So, it's finished then? My son is to be tried for murder, and my husband dies disgraced in the company of a stranger." Poirot folded his hands over his walking stick and tilted his head. "Non, madame, it is not quite finished, not yet." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Then what more is there to reveal?" Poirot spoke slowly, each word measured, quiet. "Your son committed a grave act, but not an impulsive one. No, it was a decision, premeditated in the briefest of moments, but there is something more sinister beneath it, something that does not belong to him alone." Lady Kellam raised her chin. "I beg your pardon?" Poirot stood and walked to the fireplace. He removed a small envelope from his coat pocket and held it out to her. Before Charles returned home the night of Sir Horace's death, he visited someone. Do you know who that was? "I do not." "He visited you." She blinked. "He asked for advice," Poirot continued, "on how to handle a woman who threatened to disrupt the family. He feared she might be dangerous, and you, rather than send her away, rather than open your door, you told him precisely what to do." Lady Kellam's voice was suddenly sharp. "I told him no such thing." Poirot nodded but continued, "And yet he left your room calmer, less uncertain, more resolute. How curious." He stepped closer. "You had no affection for Sir Horace. You tolerated him for his name, for the security, for the house. But you hated his unpredictability, and when you realized he intended to change his will, to grant a share of his wealth and reputation to a daughter born of disgrace, you decided it could not stand." She stood now too, but slowly, hands trembling just slightly. "I did nothing," Poirot said softly. "Non, madame, that is precisely the problem. You did nothing when you could have stopped it. You let Charles believe the only solution was silence. You encouraged the idea that disgrace was worse than guilt. You passed him the poison, perhaps not with your hands, but with your words." Her lips pressed together, but she didn't speak. Poirot went on, his voice rising just enough to fill the room. "You didn't strike Sir Horace, but you made it possible, and more than that, you ensured Edith Marsh would never speak. Not once did you seek her out. Not once did you offer her a word, a glance, a moment. She was not a stranger. She was the shadow of your husband's past, and you wanted her gone. Lady Kellam's voice returned, cool, measured. You're accusing me of complicity in a murder I did not commit? Poirot met her gaze. I'm accusing you of something worse, of guiding a weaker soul toward a crime because you lack the courage to confront the truth. You are not the hand that killed. You are the voice that allowed it. There was silence. The fire crackled. Then she sat again, slowly, the facade beginning to slip. I wanted it to end, she said. I wanted it all to stay quiet. Horace was preparing to throw everything away. For a girl he'd never claimed. He said he owed her. But what about us? What did we deserve? To watch the name Kellam handed off to a bastard? Poirot nodded quietly. So Charles killed to protect that name. But it was you who taught him that nothing mattered more than appearances. She didn't answer. Poirot crossed to the desk and retrieved one final item, a black and white photograph, the same one from the study. He pointed to the lower corner where Edith had once been captured in passing years ago. She had already been here once. You must have seen her then. Lady Kellam didn't look. She would have served you tea, perhaps helped you dress. Did you ever wonder why she looked at you with such silent attention? Did you recognize her face even then? No answer. Poirot spoke gently now. You are not the villain of this piece, Lady Kellam, but you are its architect. Lady Kellam closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they glistened with a sheen of defiance, one final flicker of pride. Would you have done differently, Monsieur Poirot? If a girl came to your door and threatened everything you'd built, everything you'd given your life to? Poirot's voice was calm. Yes, I would have opened the door. She nodded once, then looked away. Outside the window, the fog of London hung low, blurring the outlines of the world beyond the gates. In here, however, nothing remained blurred. Poirot walked toward the exit but paused at the threshold. She will not be forgotten, you know. Lady Kellam looked up. Who? Edith Marsh. He tipped his hat. She came seeking a father and found only silence. But in death, she did what she could not in life. She forced the truth to speak. And that, madame, is not disgraceful. That is justice. He left her sitting there alone. Downstairs, Japp waited with the car. He looked at Poirot's face and understood that the final piece had been placed, though no one else would be prosecuted. Lady Kellam's guilt would live in whispers, not trials. But Poirot knew that sometimes whispers last longer. Is it done then? Japp asked. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, my friend, the murderer has been caught. But the crime, the true crime, was allowed long before the blow was struck. Japp lit a cigarette. You know what I hate most? That girl came here with hope. She really believed she'd be welcomed. Poirot looked toward the mist. Oui. And for that belief, she paid the ultimate price. The car pulled away from the house at number 43 Belgrave Square, fading into the grey morning, and behind them, the memory of the girl who never worked there remained, no longer a mystery, no longer a ghost, but a name, finally spoken. Time passed with quiet inevitability after the arrest of Charles Kellam. The great house on Belgrave Square no longer carried the same air of detachment and grandeur. It had been touched by scandal, by death, by shame. And though its walls still stood proudly, they now echoed with memory rather than legacy. Hercule Poirot, having completed his role in unveiling the truth, returned to his modest flat in Whitehaven Mansions. But he followed the final outcomes closely, as he always did, not with obsession, but with a sense of moral tidiness. For Poirot, solving a case was not merely an act of logic. It was a correction of disorder, a restoration of human balance. The law moved with customary slowness, but the evidence against Charles Kellam was sufficient. The fingerprints on the vial, the jacket sighting by Sturgis, the torn note in Edith's handwriting. Each element alone was suggestive, but together they formed a web that Charles could not escape. He was formally charged with murder, though his legal team fought vigorously to reduce the case to manslaughter. Their argument, as expected, centered on emotional strain, provocation, and mental fragility, painting him as a man pushed beyond his limits by the reappearance of a past he never chose. Poirot did not attend the trial. He had no need. The facts spoke clearly enough, and his presence was not required to repeat them. But he received a letter weeks later from Inspector Japp. Verdict: guilty, second-degree murder. Sentence: life imprisonment with possibility of parole in 20 years. He showed no remorse, no confession, but no resistance either, as if he accepted it from the beginning. Poirot read the letter in silence, then folded it precisely and placed it in his drawer. The case, as far as the courts were concerned, was closed. But justice, Poirot knew, rarely ended with a sentence. Lady Kellam, once the unshakable matriarch of the Kellam name, withdrew entirely from London society. Her last public appearance was the week after the trial, at a charity function where she stood rigid and spoke only when spoken to. Whispers followed her, but none dared confront her directly. A month later, she sold the Belgrave Square residence. The new owners arrived with decorators and quiet efficiency, removing every trace of the Kellam history. Portraits were taken down, furniture replaced, even the garden hedges were trimmed into a different shape. Lady Kellam relocated to a private villa in the south of France under her maiden name, never to be seen again in public circles. There was no arrest. Poirot had never pushed for one. The moral weight of what she had done, what she had allowed, was heavier than prison walls. She would live, yes. But in solitude, her world had not ended, it had hollowed. As for the staff of the Kellam household, they scattered like leaves from a broken tree. Mrs. Drummond, once proud and orderly, left service entirely. She moved to a small town in Devon to live with her sister, quietly retiring from domestic work. Before leaving, she wrote a brief letter to Poirot. I failed her. I let fear speak louder than compassion. I pray she rests knowing someone did care, even if I showed it too late. Elsie, the scullery maid, found work in a quieter home near Richmond, where she was reportedly treated kindly and earned better wages. Poirot had arranged for a small recommendation on her behalf, unsigned but effective. She carried the experience not as shame, but as strength. Mr. Sturgis, the loyal valet, remained in service with another London household, this time with a widowed magistrate who valued discretion over drama. Sturgis never spoke of the Kellams again, but he did visit a florist every December, leaving white lilies at the gate of Belgrave Square. Poirot noticed, and what of Edith Marsh? Her body was buried quietly, without ceremony, in a small cemetery outside Clerkenwell. At first, no one claimed her. Her name meant little to those still alive. But Poirot saw to it that a headstone was placed, not extravagant, but firm, respectful. He paid for it himself, anonymously. The inscription read, Edith Marsh, 1901-1930. She sought only truth. She gave only silence. She left behind a name that now must be remembered. He visited once, just once, stood before the stone with his hat in hand and bowed his head. And then he left. There was no need to speak. She had spoken enough. The will Sir Horace had tried to amend remained in dispute for months. With Charles in prison and no direct claim by Edith, the estate fell to litigation. In the end, most of the assets were absorbed by distant cousins, distant charities, nothing scandalous, just quiet redistribution. The Kellam name lived on, barely, but not with pride. As for Poirot, he took no payment. When offered, he refused politely. "I did not do this for your family, madame," he had told Lady Kellam. "I did this for a girl who had no one." He returned to his routines. Breakfast at 8. Newspaper folded properly. Egg boiled precisely 5.5 minutes. Slippers aligned. But from time to time he would glance toward his desk drawer, the one containing Edith's torn letter and the photograph from the Kellam estate. He never destroyed them. He kept them as quiet reminders. Not every case ends with applause. Some end in silence, and some in sorrow. One rainy afternoon, some months later, Poirot received a parcel with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. The Kellam house, now stripped of its gates, its grandeur faded. On the back was written, in careful script, she was never the maid, she was always the daughter. Poirot smiled faintly and returned it to the envelope. Justice, in this case, had not come with grand pronouncements or dramatic trials. It had come in small acts, in broken pride, in lived consequences, in names finally spoken aloud. And in that, Edith Marsh, forgotten by her father, ignored by society, rejected by wealth, had at last been seen. It was a grey morning in early spring when Hercule Poirot returned to Belgrave Square, not for duty, not for investigation, but for closure. The Kellam house stood vacant now. The new owners had not yet moved in. Boards covered the front windows. A thin layer of dust collected along the iron railing. The once meticulous hedges had grown unruly, the gate creaking in the wind like a voice trying to speak after months of silence. It looked smaller than Poirot remembered. Not physically, but symbolically. The grandeur had bled out. He stood on the pavement, gazing up at the second floor where Edith Marsh had once been hidden in plain sight, where she had waited quietly, dressed in a borrowed uniform, hoping someone would look at her long enough to truly see her. Poirot held his hat in both hands, his gaze steady. He had nothing left to say to the house, but to the memory it held, that was different. He crossed the square and sat on a weather-worn bench opposite the property. Around him, London moved on. A taxi sped past. A mother hurried a child along the curb. A newspaper boy shouted something inaudible on the corner. Life, indifferent and impatient, continued without pause. But Poirot sat still, reflecting. This case had unsettled him more than most, not for its complexity, though the lies had been layered with care, but because of its simplicity beneath the surface. A child rejected, a family ashamed, a society obsessed with appearances, and in the end, a tragedy that had never needed to happen. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. In his youth, Poirot had believed that solving a murder was enough, that finding the culprit restored balance to the world. But age had changed him. Now he saw that justice often came late, and when it arrived, it did not always heal. Edith Marsh had died quietly. Her life had barely caused a ripple in the world that ignored her. And yet in dying, she forced the truth into the light. She became something more than what society had allowed her to be. She became remembered. He thought again of Lady Kellam, stoic, cold, hiding her complicity behind posture and etiquette, and of Charles, arrogant, entitled, but ultimately weak. Poirot had seen many killers, but Charles had not killed out of hatred. He had killed out of fear, fear of what Edith represented. Not just inheritance, but exposure, a crack in the perfect portrait of privilege. And yet, as Poirot had told Lady Kellam, the true crime had started long before the blow to Sir Horace's head. It had started with silence, with a child never acknowledged, with a truth too shameful for polite society. Poirot opened his eyes and looked up once more. The window shutters clattered slightly in the wind. Like the flutter of paper, he imagined Edith again, standing in that room, in that uniform, looking down at the world she thought she was finally entering, a world she believed had a place for her. And instead, She was met with shame, indifference, then poison. Poirot's throat tightened, ever so slightly. He was not a sentimental man, not by nature. But this case had pierced something deeper. He reached into his coat and pulled out the folded photograph of the Kellam estate, the one he had kept. Not for evidence, for memory. He unfolded it now and stared once more at the barely visible figure in the lower corner. Her face, half-turned, her posture modest. Just one of many nameless staff in the background, and yet she had been the key to everything. The secret the family hoped would stay buried. Poirot traced her outline gently with his thumb. "She came for truth," he whispered aloud. "And you sent her away." He folded the photo and returned it to his coat. Then he stood, brushed a speck of dust from his lapel, and adjusted his cuffs with quiet purpose. The wind picked up as he walked away from the square, his footsteps even and deliberate. Back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot returned to the order that defined his life. He trimmed the rose stems in his windowsill vase, adjusted the doilies under the candlesticks, and dusted the porcelain cat on his bookshelf. All was in place, symmetrical and exact. But later that evening, as he sat by the fireplace, he pulled out his personal case book, the one he kept not for the courts, but for himself. A thin leather volume with gold-embossed corners and neatly written entries. He opened to a fresh page and wrote, "Case, the maid who didn't work. Their victim, Edith Marsh. Born into silence. Died in truth. Her killer was not simply Charles Kellam, but a house, a name, a society that found her inconvenient. Her greatest crime, wanting to belong. Her greatest act, making us remember her." Poirot closed the book. He sat for a long while after that, listening to the quiet tick of the mantel clock. In a world that often valued titles over tenderness, etiquette over empathy, he would remember Edith Marsh. Not as a maid, not as a scandal, but as a daughter who finally had her name spoken. As the clock struck 9, Poirot rose, turned off the light, and left the room in perfect order. And in that quiet, Edith Marsh lived on, not as a mystery, but as a memory. Some weeks later, as spring light returned to London, Poirot found himself seated at a small wooden desk in the office of the city registrar. The room was unremarkable. Grey filing cabinets, rubber stamps, faint scent of old paper, but what he had come to do was not ordinary. The clerk at the counter, a man with horn-rimmed spectacles and mild indifference, skimmed the request Poirot had placed before him. He raised an eyebrow. "You're petitioning to update the death record of one Edith Marsh." "Why? And you are not a relative?" "No," Poirot replied. "But I was the only one who listened to her." The man looked down at the form again. "This kind of request is rare. People usually forget the deceased, not amend them." Poirot offered a faint smile. "That, monsieur, is precisely the problem." After a moment's pause, the clerk nodded. "We'll process the request. The note will read, 'Recognized posthumously as the illegitimate daughter of Sir Horace Kellam per investigative records and testimony submitted to Scotland Yard.'" Poirot inclined his head. "Merci." He left without ceremony. No parade, no applause. But he carried something important, something the courts could not award and society could not deny: acknowledgement. And in his mind, that mattered more than any conviction. He spent the rest of the day walking the quieter edges of the city. Clerkenwell, where Edith had once lived, Pimlico, where she had last worked, and finally, the graveyard. There, beneath a thin elm tree, stood the headstone he had arranged. Still modest, still clean, still visited by no one but him and, occasionally, Sturgis. He stood before it now. No hat, no gloves, just Poirot, a man of exactness and formality, allowing a moment of humility. "She has a name now," he said aloud. not only in death, but in memory. He knelt, placed a small bouquet of lilies at the base, and stood again. You were not the maid, you were not the lie, you were the one true thing in a house of masks. He walked away in silence. Back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot was greeted by his post, bills, invitations, newspapers, and one envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph. Again, the Kellam house, but now empty. The hedges cut down, the plaque removed, and in the corner, a small handwritten message. She was seen, no name signed, but Poirot knew it had come from someone who once served there. Perhaps Sturgis, perhaps Mrs. Drummond. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Edith Marsh had not vanished. Later that evening, Poirot prepared his report. Not for the police, not for the press, but for himself. He sat down, opened his casebook, and wrote, "The case of Edith Marsh is not one of murder alone. It is a case of omission, of generational cruelty polished in silver and buried beneath fine rugs. She entered a world that had no place for her and left behind a truth that forced it to look at itself. The guilty have been punished, yes. But let us not confuse punishment with justice. Justice came when her name was acknowledged, when silence became speech, when the maid who didn't work there was finally given her title, daughter." Poirot closed the book, and this time he left the page unmarked by the case number. It would remain the final entry, for this story had no sequel. It had only a truth that waited too long to be told. He rose, adjusted his tie, and straightened the candlesticks on his mantel. Everything in its place, even the past,